Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, January 15th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humani ingeni est odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. While we're preoccupied with politics at home, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States that is by far the most feared government in the world, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel. The wars the U.S. is waging in 8 countries and its war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear, war. Although most Americans are not aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, killing people, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. They're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. More than 250,000 American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. No other country has more than a dozen such bases. China has 1. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, and torture. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged major country, at the end of World War II. It's unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon President Trump and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, for Americans who have been made poorer by generations of our government's wars. It's astonishing that, in spite of Trump's anti-war moves from Korea to Syria, the U.S. political establishment is hysterical to get rid of him. The answer is that it's because of Trump's anti-war moves from Korea to Syria that the U.S. political establishment is hysterical to get rid of him. U.S. foreign policy, as the Obama presidency demonstrates, from Ukraine to the South China Sea, is based on using war and war provocations to retard Eurasian integration, Russia and China, in order to maintain U.S. economic dominance of the Asia-Pacific and hence the profits of the 1%. Trump has criticized and to some extent acted against that fundamental principle. He has to be driven from office before he can do more damage in the eyes of the permanent government of the United States. The media and that establishment claim to be outraged at Trump's demand to build a wall on the southern border of the U.S., which does seem to be an outrageous idea. Tell me how I can believe your outrage is genuine when you profess to be disgusted by Trump's wall, but you never objected to Israel's wall or the billions of US dollars that enable apartheid Israel to exist and to build it. We try to talk about what's been called news the corporate media is scared you'll see. For example, a mainstream MSNBC and NBC journalist publicly quit his job this month, saying the networks have become nothing but cheerleaders for the war. The Yellow Vest protests blew up across France, demanding the resignation of Emmanuel Macron and winning a load of concessions from the neoliberal banker's president. Their success has led many to theorize about what those protests would look like in the U.S. We recommend the hour-long news comedy special, it's called Not Allowed on American TV, only available at leecampcomedyspecial.com, a much more serious news program than mainstream media. And the government is still shut down. FAA inspectors are no longer inspecting planes. The wall isn't being built. People are waking up and rebelling against the exploitative system we live in. And being affiliated with climate change denial is becoming more toxic by the day. The slightest threat of peace and the corporate media's hair is on fire. The Yellow Vest movement in France is having a major impact and gaining international attention, already spreading to other nations, with some nations like Egypt banning the sale of yellow vests to prevent the protests from spreading there. The movement is showing that disrupting business as usual gets results. Will it come to the United States? We're all the news that your corporate media would prefer. We're all about the news that your corporate media would prefer that you thought of as Russian propaganda. You know, the accurate descriptions of corporate behavior that make them look bad. We forget both Obama and Trump were wrongly seen as peace candidates. As Democratic elites reunite with neocons, the party's voters are becoming far more militaristic and pro-war than Republicans. In the last presidential election, the permanent government, or deep state, went from backing Republicans to backing the known belligerent Hillary Clinton. Note what happens at Hillary's 2016 rally when the military got a USA, USA chant going. This is also one area where Bernie Sanders backers need to be reminded of why Sanders doesn't deserve the support he gets, or his 2020 run for President of the United States is projected to receive. Sanders is, as blackagendareport.com reminds us, a shepherd for the Democratic Party, getting those errant sheep back in the ranks. And NBC's Meet the Press told us that Sanders is down with war. And he's not alone. The Democratic Party is pro-war. This is, of course, not the first time that Democratic voters have wildly shifted their beliefs based on the party affiliation, their foreign policy beliefs, based on the party affiliation of the person occupying the Oval Office. The party's base spent the Bush-Cheney years denouncing war on terror policies, such as assassinations, drones, and Guantanamo, as moral atrocities and war crimes, only to suddenly support those policies once they became hallmarks of the Obama presidency. But what's happening here is far more insidious. A core ethos of the anti-Trump resistance has become militarism, jingoism, and neoconservatism. Trump is frequently attacked by Democrats using long-standing Cold War scripts wielded for decades against them by the far right. For example, Trump is insufficiently belligerent with U.S. enemies. He's willing to allow the bad countries to take over by bringing home U.S. soldiers. His efforts to establish less hostile relations with adversary countries, peer competitors as they're called in foreign policy business, Russia and China, is indicative of weakness or even of treason. In the 1950s, I'm old enough to remember, the Birch Society, the far right, condemned the Eisenhower Republicans for, quote, 40 years of treason. Everyone knew then that that was nonsense. But now the leading papers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, are calling the president a traitor. At the same time, Democratic policy elites in Washington are once again formally aligning with neoconservatives, even to the point of creating joint foreign policy advocacy groups, a reunion that predated Trump. The leading Democratic Party think tank, the Center for American Progress, donated $200,000 to the Neoconservative American Enterprise Institute and has multi-level alliances with warmongering institutions. By far the most influential liberal media outlet, MSNBC, is stuffed full of former Bush-Cheney officials, security state operatives, and agents, even when the liberal stars are notably while even their liberal stars, MSNBC's liberal spokespeople, are notably hawkish. A decade ago, long before she went as far down the pro-war and Cold War rabbit hole as she now occupies, Rachel Maddow heralded herself as, quote, a national security liberal who was all about counterterrorism, close quote. Some things don't change. All of this has resulted in a new generation of Democrats, politically engaged for the first time as a result of fears over Trump, being inculcated with values of militarism and imperialism, trained to view once discredited war-loving neocons such as Bill Kristol, Max Boot, and David Frum, and former CIA and FBI leaders as noble experts and trusted voices of conscience. It's inevitable that all these trends would produce a party that is increasingly pro-war and militaristic, and polling data now leaves little doubt that this transformation, which will endure long after Trump is gone, is well underway. We'll come back to these issues as the hour goes on. You are watching Aware on the Air, where our task is to talk about the war news that is not being featured on mainstream media or is being featured only in terms of what's been called Trump derangement syndrome. It's all his fault. There is, in fact, a development recently in regard to the presidency and the war policy of the major parties, the permanent government, that's worth paying attention to. Is there a possibility of a real peace candidate for the vicious Democrats? Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both support U.S. war making. But now there is a new figure on the horizon that's worth taking account of as far as the Democrats are concerned. Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard has announced her intent to campaign for president, and the entire political spectrum is up in arms about it. Mainstream liberals and neocons are calling her a Putin puppet and Assad's best friend forever. Leftists and progressives are criticizing her associations with right-wing factions in India and anti-LGBT comments she made in the early 2000s. Conspiracy analysts are criticizing her Council on Foreign Relations membership, and the Zionist elements of Trump's base are openly promising to destroy her candidacy. A lot of others, including Caitlin Johnstone, who wrote the piece that I'm reading now, got a lot more interested in the 2020 elections when she threw her hat in. Johnstone says she's not interested in defending Gabbard from the criticisms that have been leveled at her at this time. Many articles have been written towards that end already. If she's going to run for the most powerful elected office on the planet, it's fair to scrutinize and question what kind of person she is. Johnstone is also not interested in endorsing anyone for presidency. What she is interested in is the way Gabbard's presence in the Democratic presidential primary race is already, in January 2019, upsetting the standard establishment script and forcing foreign policy debates that need to happen. Here are 5 thoughts on the subject. 1, Tulsi Gabbard will definitely be the most anti-war candidate on the debate stage by a wide margin, except in the highly unlikely event that someone steps up from way out of left field to run like Dennis Kucinich, for example. Being the most anti-war candidate in anything associated with the Democratic Party is a very low bar. but her vocal positions on Syria, Iran, Yemen, Russia, North Korea, Afghanistan, Gaza, and previous U.S. regime change interventions set her so far from the establishment orthodoxy that she'll look as different from the other candidates as Ron Paul looked on the Republican debate stage, and for much the same reason. 2, make no mistake, it is this opposition to significant aspects of the U.S. war machine that's the driving force behind the overwhelming bulk of the shrieking objection to Gabbard's candidacy, not any of the more valid criticisms. We've learned from the mainstream acceptance of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that some criticism of the status quo will be tolerated when it comes to domestic policy, but it's an excommunicable offense when it comes to foreign policy. The idea that the U.S. should forcefully control world affairs using the carrot of alliance and the stick of military violence is so ubiquitous in both of America's mainstream parties that it takes a Washington Post columnist getting dismembered alive to start a debate about something so self-evidently evil as the Saudi-led destruction of Yemen. The references to the murder of Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul clearly at the directions of the Saudi government. 3, foreign policy is undeniably the area in which the greater part of U.S. government depravity takes place. And as far as America's permanent government is concerned, it is by far the most important. Forcing a debate on an issue you're not even supposed to bring up on mainstream media will get a lot of ordinary Americans asking questions that very powerful individuals don't want asked. The Democratic National Committee went from scheduling over 20 debates in 2008 to trying to limit it to 6 in 2016 because they didn't want Sanders' excellent domestic policy ideas getting out to the public and making their coronated status quo candidate, Hillary Clinton, look bad. Gabbard could have the same impact on foreign policy in an audience that has been aggressively propagandized by MSNBC warmongering. 4, Gabbard's progressive positions on issues like Medicare for all, environmentalism, $15 minimum wage, Wall Street accountability, the failed war on drugs, marijuana legalization, criminal justice reform, and indigenous water rights will also set her further to the left on domestic policy than anyone on the debate stage besides Sanders should be run. Should he run? This is a self-evident fact, but a lot of narrative control efforts are being poured into painting her as a right-winger. She will definitely help force the debate to the left, but her position on withdrawing from expensive interventionist war policies answers the "but how are we going to pay for it?" questions the mainstream media talking heads are so fond of grilling progressives with on social programs. 5, the most telling thing about Gabbard is the way she resigned from her position as vice chair of the Democratic National Committee in order to endorse Bernie Sanders in 2016. Other DNC operatives remained inside the committee and actively schemed to give Clinton every unfair advantage in the primary, but Gabbard showed integrity and refused to advance a biased agenda in violation of the DNC charter. It shows she's a real person operating within one of the phoniest places in the world, and that she's willing to throw a spanner in the works of when it's in the highest interest. This unwillingness to march to the beat of the establishment, drum for such proceedings could lead to some very interesting things as the presidential race heats up. And that's good enough for me. She's not perfect. She's a major long shot to actually win. But Tulsi Gabbard's campaign for president will definitely shake things up in all the right places, and good things will come from it, which is why all the right people are outraged by her bid today. She has, for example, been attacked by the Social Democratic Jacobin magazine when, in fact, her anti-war candidacy would seem to be the sort of thing that Jacobin would support. There is a great deal more to be said here. You are watching Aware on the Air, we're talking about the the absent anti-war argument from contemporary American political discussion. The overwhelming propaganda exercise of the mainstream media on all sides, from all parties, about the importance of America's wars and ongoing wars is not to be believed in either sense. Remember when the war on terror ended and the war on populism began? That's okay, no one else remembers either. It happened in the summer of 2016, also known as the Summer of Fear. The war on terror was going splendidly. There'd been a series of terrorist attacks in Orlando, Nice, Würzburg, Munich, Reutlingen, Ansbach, and Saint-Ancien de Rouvray, each of them perpetrated by suddenly self-radicalized lone wolf terrorists, or non-terrorist terrorists, who'd absolutely no connection to any type of organized terrorist groups prior to suddenly self-radicalizing themselves by consuming terrorist content on the internet. It seemed we were entering a new and even more terrifying phase of the global war on terror, a phase in which anyone could be a terrorist, and terrorism could mean almost anything. The broadening of the already virtually meaningless definition of terrorism was transpiring just in time for Obama to hand off the reins to Hillary Clinton, who everyone knew was going to be the next president, and was going to have to bomb the crap out of Syria in response to the non-terrorist terrorist threat. The war on terror, or rather, quote, the series of persistent targeted efforts to dismantle specific networks of violent extremists that threatened America, close quote, as Obama rebranded it, was going to continue, probably forever. The Brexit referendum had just taken place, but no one had really digested that yet. And then Trump won the nomination. Like that scene in Orwell's 1984, which is worth rereading these days, by the way, where the party switches official enemies right in the middle of the Hate Week rally, the war on terror was officially canceled and replaced by the war on populism. Oh, all right, it wasn't quite that abrupt. But seriously, go back and scan the news. Note how the Islamic terrorist threat we'd been conditioned to live in fear of on a daily basis since 2001 seemed to just vanish into thin air. Suddenly, the existential threat we were facing was neo-nationalism, illiberalism, or the pejorative designator du jour, populism. Here we are 2.5 years later, and democracy is under constant attack by a host of malevolent populist forces. Russo-fascist black vote suppressors, debauchers Odinovicek assassins, Bernie Sanders, the yellow-vested French, emboldened non-exploding mail bombers, Jeremy Corbyn's Nazi death cult, and brain-devouring Russian Cubano crickets. If you don't know that last reference, read about the American embassy in Havana. It's a story too bizarre to pause on now. The President of the United States is apparently both a Russian intelligence operative and literally the resurrection of Hitler. NBC and MSNBC have been officially merged with the CIA. The Guardian, the British liberal paper, has dispensed with any pretense of journalism and is just making stories up out of whole cloth. That's literally true. Anyone who has ever visited Russia or met with a Russian or read a Russian novel is on an enemies of democracy watch list, as is anyone refusing to vacation in Israel, which the Senate is now in the process of making mandatory for all U.S. citizens. Meanwhile, the terrorists are nowhere to be found, except for the terrorists we've been using to attempt to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, the sadistic, nerve-gassing monster of Syria, who illegally invaded and conquered his own country in defiance of the international community. All this madness has something to do with populism, although it isn't clear what. Leading theory is the Russians are behind it. They've got some sort of hypno-technology, not to be confused with those brain-eating crickets in Cuba, capable of manipulating the minds of, black people mostly, but not just black people. Obviously, they're also controlling the French, who they've transformed into racist, hate-filled liars who are, quote, attacking elected representatives, journalists, Jews, foreigners, and homosexuals, according to French President Emmanuel Macron, the anointed golden boy of Europe. More terrifying still, Putin is now able to project words out of Trump's mouth in real time, literally using Trump's head as a puppet, or like one of those Mission Impossible masks. Rachel Maddow conclusively proved this by spending a couple of hours on Google comparing the words coming out of Trump's mouth to words that had come out of Russian mouths, but had never come out of American mouths when they turned out to be the exact same words, or pretty close to the exact same words. Apparently, Putin's master plan for total populist world domination and establishment of the 1,000 years Duganist Reich was to provoke the global capitalist ruling classes, the corporate media, and their credulous disciples into devolving into stark raving lunatics or blithering idiots, or a combination of both. But seriously, all that actually happened back in the summer of 2016 was the global capitalist ruling classes recognized that they had a problem. The problem that they recognized they had and continue to have and are now acutely aware of is that no one is enjoying global capitalism except the global capitalist ruling classes. The whole smiley, happy, supranational, neo-feudal corporate empire concept is not going over very well with the masses, or at least not with the unwashed masses. People started voting for right-wing parties and Brexit and other populist measures, not because they had suddenly transformed into Nazis, but because the right was acknowledging and exploiting their anger with the advance of global neoliberalism, while liberals in the identity politics left were slow jamming the TPP with Obama and babbling about transgender bathrooms and such. The global capitalist ruling classes needed to put a stop to that. That is, the populist revolt, not the bathroom debate. So they suspended the global war on terror and launched the war on populism. It was originally only meant to last until Hillary Clinton's coronation or the second Brexit referendum, then switched back to the war on terror, but, weird things happen, and here we are. We'll get back to the war on terror eventually, as the war on populism is essentially just a temporary rebranding of it. At the end, it's all the same counterinsurgency. When a system is globally hegemonic, as our current model of capitalism is, every war is a counterinsurgency. That is, a campaign waged against an internal enemy. As there are no external enemies to fight, the character of the internal enemies might change: Islamic terrorism, extremism, fascism, populism, Trumpism, Corbynism, etc. But they're all insurgencies against the hegemonic system, which in our case is global capitalism, not the United States of America. The way I see it, the global capitalist ruling classes now have less than 2 years to put down this current populist insurgency. First and foremost, they need to get rid of Trump, who, despite his bombastic nativist rhetoric, is clearly no hero of the common people, nor any real threat to global capitalism, but who has become an anti-establishment symbol, like a walking, talking FU to both the American and global neoliberal elites. Then they need to get a handle on Europe, which isn't going to be particularly easy. What happens next in France will be telling, as well whatever becomes of Brexit, being decided in part today, which I continue to believe will never actually happen, except perhaps in some nominal sense. And then there's the battle for hearts and minds, which they've been furiously waging for the last 2 years, and which is only going to intensify. If you think things are crazy now, which clearly they are, strap yourself in. What is coming is going to make COINTELPRO look like the work of some amateur meme freak. The neoliberal corporate media, psyops like Integrity Initiative, internet censoring apps like NewsGuard, Share Blue, and other David Brock outfits, and a legion of mass hysteria generators will be relentlessly barraging our brains with absurdity, disinformation, and just outright lies, as will their counterparts on the right, of course, in case you thought there were any alternatives. It's going to get extremely zany. The good news is, by the time it's all over and Trump has been dealt with and normality restored and the working classes put back in their places, we probably won't remember that any of this happened. We'll finally be able to sort out those bathrooms and get back to paying the interest on our debts and to living in more or less constant fear of an imminent, devastating terrorist attack. And won't that be an enormous relief? The war on populism, described by C.J. Hopkins. You are watching Aware on the Air, where our task is to talk about the wars that the U.S. government is conducting with something approaching a reasonable account. Those wars are encouraged by the party that has been called the neocons in the United States, a group of pro-war intellectuals, media people, academics, who speak for what has been rather inaccurately referred to as neoconservative. If you think that, as neoconservatives, if you think that conservatism in America in a 20th century sense is sort of that tradition of, say, Robert Taft in the middle of the century, you're a long way from the neoconservatism that we're speaking of today. That conservatism, condemned as isolationism by the pro-war Roosevelt government in the 1930s and 40s, that conservatism has disappeared entirely in spite of attempts, rare and unsuccessful, to revive it. Neoconservatism was a pro-war, and is a pro-war movement based on American concerns that are not very happy. Matt Taibbi has written about him recently in the Rolling Stone. Neoconservatism's the architects of the war on terror, are the political version of Jason in Friday the 13th. You can never bank on them being completely dead. They just hide under a log until the next funder appears. The neocon Media Tribune, a major public outlet, the Weekly Standard, did indeed fold recently. In no time, they had a new voice, the Bulwark, edited by former Weekly Standard and current NBC, MSNBC contributor Charlie Sykes, with Weekly Standard founder Bill Kristol listed as editor-at-large. The Bulwark features a quasi-Soviet realist title font, probably meant to be ironic. There's also a three-masted ship for a logo, which senior editor Benjamin Parker tells me is a reference to the nautical definition of bulwark, that is, the wall of a ship that extends higher than the top deck to keep things from going overboard. Also, we thought it looked cool, he said. So that's the new neoconservative publication. Lenin preferred the more landlocked symbolism of a political vanguard, but a bulwark of the people was also pretty close to what he was shooting for. Depressingly, this is no coincidence. The End of History author Francis Fukuyama once made the same comparison. He broke with the neocons 3 years into the Iraq War disaster in 2006 via a New York Times article called After Neoconservatism. Fukuyama explained he saw himself more like Marx, a historian who merely described a long-term process of social evolution. Only his end of history, Fukuyama's, terminates in liberal democracy rather than communism. But the neocons, Fukuyama explained, saw themselves more like Lenin. Quote, they believed that history can be pushed along with the right application of power and will, close quote. Neocons began as liberal intellectuals, the likes of Bill Kristol's father, Irving, who famously said a neoconservative was a liberal who'd been, quote, mugged by reality, close quote, drifted from the Democratic Party in the 70s because it had become insufficiently hawkish after the Vietnam debacle. They abhorred realpolitik and containment, hated Richard Nixon for going to China, and preferred using force to spread American values, even if it meant removing an existing government. Reagan's evil empire gibberish and semi-legal muscle flexing in places like Nicaragua made neocons tingly and finalized their defection to the Red Party. The neocon-Republican marriage wasn't exactly smooth. After all, it required sanctimonious left-leaning intellectuals to get in political bed with the Jerry Falwells of the world and embrace all sorts of positions they plainly felt were absurd. But they believed pretending to support religiosity or other popular passions was fine for ruling elites, to pretend so. This was supposedly a version of Plato's noble lie concepts, as Irving Kristol wrote in commentary half a century ago. Quote, if religion is an illusion that the majority of men cannot live without, let men believe in the lies of religion, and then let a handful of sages who know the truth and can live with it keep it among themselves, Kristol wrote, adding, men are then divided into the wise and the foolish, the philosophers and the common men, close quote. Using this strategy, the self-appointed handful of sages rode the mule of Republican politics all the way to the White House. By the early 2000s, they achieved such status that David Frum, the speechwriter who coined George W. Bush's axis of evil, felt confident in publicly calling for the excommunication of libertarians, isolationists, nationalists, and all sorts of other breeds from the church of the GOP. Anti-war conservatives had turned their backs on the country, Frum wrote. Now we turn our backs on them. Having alienated big chunks of the Republican coalition, the group then sank the mainstream GOP politically with the idiotic prosecution of the Iraq War. Because they started this Middle East disaster on a lie, and even bragged about doing so, quote, we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality, close quote, Bush administration said. They undermine faith in a smorgasbord of American institutions, from the news media to the presidency to the intelligence community to their own party. This was a huge reason for the rise of Trump, who ran against elites and capitalized on voters' loss of trust in institutions like the press. Conveniently, neocons had already begun tacking back to the Democrats by then. The Bulwark's first video reveals the new strategy. It shows editor Charlie Sykes taking on the difficult question of what's wrong with Trump's wall? This should be a short video. How long does because it's effing stupid take? But it gets windy because the Bulwark claims to be opposed to Trump's reported plan to use emergency powers to start construction. Quote, if conservatives are willing to go along with the President of the United States overriding the legislative process, asked Sykes, what will they think when there is a liberal Democratic president who simply declares a national emergency to invoke other sorts of progressive legislation? Close quote. Cue scary shots of Bernie Sanders, Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren. In Warren's case, they show a recent video of her speaking in Iowa, where she was asked if she would roll back Trump's tax cuts. Quote, for the billionaires and the big corporations, you bet, Warren says. If you're wondering where you saw a similar message recently, it was in the New York Times in a piece called Democrats find a familiar foil in 2020, billionaires, even liberal ones. The hand-wringing Times article noted it was convenient for Warren and Sanders to challenge billionaires because, quote, neither has the financial wherewithal to fund their own campaigns. Read, neither are billionaires. That piece went on to warn that while billionaire bashing may feel good, it ignores that some of progressivism's best friends are rich. Quote, while casting billionaires like Mr. Bloomberg as plutocrats may resonate among some Democrats, longtime party advisors point out Ms. Warren and Mr. Sanders are ignoring historical reality. Several of the party's wealthiest leaders have been among its most progressive, close quote. So longtime Democratic Party advisors are once again triangulating against their party's own progressive wing, which was the core strategy of the original Third Way Democrats in the early 90s. Party leaders now want to kick out populist, anti-war liberals in the same way Fromm once wanted to excommunicate anti-war conservatives. This overlaps nicely with neocons' efforts to stake out the same turf between Trump and Sanders. This is becoming a little like watching two people pretending not to be attracted to one another when everyone knows they are. I'd say the bulwark neocons and their Democratic allies need to get a room, except that they already have MSNBC, as noted by recently resigned reporter William Arkin, who complained the network had become a forum for, quote, a single war party, close quote. As Glenn Greenwald noted in The Intercept last year, the most extreme and discredited neocons began uniting with Democrats long before the ascension of Donald Trump. These two groups came together over a common enemy, the insufficiently bloodthirsty Barack Obama, which we know, in fact, was a lie. Obama was just as vicious as Bill Clinton and the Bushes. He was just more sneaky about it. In July 2014, in the next act of the neocons, New York Times writer Jacob Heilbrunn predicted the future union. Quote, even as they castigate Mr. Obama, the neocons may be preparing a more brazen feat, aligning themselves with Hillary Rodham Clinton and her nascent presidential campaign in a bid to return to the driver's seat of American foreign policy. That's because they could count on Hillary as a warmonger. Democracy Journal ran a similar piece in 2015 into which Robert Kagan talked about a union with Democrats, hoping to replace the term neoconservative with a less infamous-sounding liberal interventionist. Hillary again. The union achieved formal expression in 2016 with groups like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is backed by neocons like Crystal and Jamie Fly, as well as former Joe Biden and Clinton campaign security advisor Jake Sullivan. These are the same people advising Facebook about which sites to zap. Last week, Revolutionary Left Radio was the latest alt-media voice to get the axe. Both groups praised Trump's early missile strikes on Syria. Crystal, echoing his dad, said Trump had been mugged by reality. Kagan said the strikes should just be an opening salvo. Both were horrified by Trump's recent tweet about withdrawing from the Middle East. The neocons are trying to create with Democrats a true political movement of shared goals and common adversaries. Apart from liberal interventionism, they're emphasizing stridently anti-populist leanings, making little distinction between Trump and mouth breathers like Representative Steve King on one hand and Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the other. One-time neoconservative icon Max Boot even went so far as to compare Ocasio-Cortez to Sarah Palin, bemoaning the fact that she has more Twitter followers than Nancy Pelosi. More evidence of democracy's imperfections. Both groups get starry-eyed around generals and spooks and mourn the resignation of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, like music lovers after the death of Prince. I am shaken, said Nancy Pelosi when Mattis left. There were even shared fantasies about a presidential run by the Nosferatoid ex-defense secretary, whose greatest achievements to date had been grimacing with military severity while standing next to Trump and clamoring for an increased role in the bombing of Yemen, It If you're not concerned about undead neocons making a comeback while Trump is in office, that's understandable. Many people will take allies against Trump from wherever they can get them. Just don't be surprised as liberal interventionists are sitting in the White House once Trump leaves the scene. These are determined revolutionaries, pro-war revolutionaries, who've been scheming for years to throw a saddle on the Democratic Party after decades in bed with Republicans. Sadly, they have willing partners over there on the Democratic side. You're watching Aware on the Air. This is an account by Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone about the neocons, the pro-war party, the aggressively pro-war party in the American government, and their alliance with the Democratic Party. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to turn to an article by the longtime war reporter Robert Fisk, an Englishman who is writing about the U.S. media. He argues that the U.S. media has, just this month, lost one of its sanest voices on military matters. Fisk writes, "I hate television experts, the infamous analysts who know all and support all about the military, the televisual ex-generals with vain presidential ambitions, and the infamous American think tank personnel whose right-wing pro-Israeli beliefs are carefully shielded from viewers by the U.S. networks who employ them. I always characterize the antiseptic and pseudo-academic institutions to which they belong as the Institute for Preposterous Affairs. The Fisk IPA, institute that he has described as American think tanks, contains hundreds of robotic folk who will churn out claptrap about key players, stakeholders, and moderate allies, and of course, world terror. They turn up on CNN, Fox, and even Russia Today, and of course the BBC. But William Arkin was always a bit different. This ex-U.S. Marine intelligence author of groundbreaking work on secret CIA black sites and equally secret U.S. weapons dumps, nuclear and non-nuclear, has a respectful audience at both Harvard and Maxwell U.S. Air Force Base, and when he quits, I take notice. Here's a guy the Reagan administration wanted to send to prison for revealing the location of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons, and who, in his own words, quote, had to fight editors who couldn't believe that there could be a war in Iraq, close quote. He's just resigned his job as a talking head. Goodbye, NBC News, and that's what I call a real story. And here's what Arkin told his colleagues about the American military when he left NBC last week. Quote, "There's not a soul in Washington," he wrote to them, "who can say that they have won or stopped any conflict. And though there might be the beloved perfume princes in the form of the David Petraeuses and Wesley Clarks, or the so-called warrior monks like James Mattis and H.R. McMaster, we've had more than a generation of national security leaders who sadly and fraudulently done little of consequence," close quote. Arkin's draw is that he doesn't suck on the rubber tube of WikiLeaks or social media whistleblowers. He prefers to dig down through the pages of dull, boring, real military information available in serious Army and Air Force journals and official government documents. I came across his work, writes Robert Fisk, when a raider in Japan sent me pages from Arkin's book, Code Names, Deciphering U.S. Military Plans, Programs, and Operations in the 9/11 World. I was investigating, Fisk writes, just how Israel was able to maintain its massive aerial bombardments of Lebanon and Gaza without running out of smart bombs, cluster munitions, and air-to-ground missiles. Even NATO ran low on ammunition in the 1999 Serbian War. But not Israel, what is blasting its enemies, including lots and lots of civilians, in the Middle East. So here's what I found in Arkin's work as long ago as 2005. Quietly, he wrote, the U.S. maintains pre-positioned equipment and munitions, on Israeli soil for use by U.S. and Israeli forces. The War Reserve Stocks for Allies Israel, WRSI, program includes ammunition owned by the U.S. but intended for Israeli use, overseen by the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Locations, according to Arkin, include Ben Gurion International Airport, Herzliya Pituach, Nevatim Airfield, and Avda Air Base. So there you have it. The Arkin system of picking up rocket arm intelligence is not impossible, providing you have the patience to sit down and read. Fisk says, I wrote a story for The Independent out of Israel when Israeli lobbyists were fearful the U.S. might be restricting arms supplies to Ariel Sharon as a means of forcing him to sign up to a new Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. They had nothing to worry about, I reported. Only a month earlier, the Americans had rolled out their first S-70A5 troop-carrying Black Hawk helicopter to be sold to the Israelis. Israel had purchased 25 of the new machines, costing over $200 million, most of which would be paid by the U.S., even though it had 24 earlier model Black Hawks. The logbook of the first new helicopters was ceremoniously handed over to the then Director General of the Israeli Defense Ministry, Amos Yaron. I was immediately abused, writes Fisk. I had revealed Israel's military secrets. A telephone call from an Israeli supporter in London told me. I'd leaked military secrets for Israel's enemies to read, an anonymous reader informed me. It was balderdash. I had merely done what I always do in Israel, scrupulously read the local papers and studied economic and military magazines, because the Israelis were always boasting of their homemade weaponry and military relationship with the U.S. The story cost only a few shekels and a newsagent's in Tel Aviv. But Arkin goes for facts in a much bigger way. He hoovers them up off every page, and NBC have just lost him. His expertise, he says, seems to be of less value now. He was out of sync with the network, in his own words. Journalists were turning the world's national security into a political story. Rumsfeld versus the generals, Wolfowitz versus Shinseki, the CIA versus Cheney, bad torturers versus the more refined variety. And all the while, Arkin writes, NBC would be looking over its shoulder at, quote, upstarts creeping up on the mainstream, close quote. Internet news. After Donald Trump's election, journalistic investigation, quote, got sucked into the retreating vortex, increasingly lost in a directionless adrenaline rush, the national security and political version of leading the broadcast with every snowstorm. In many ways, NBC just began emulating the national security state itself, busy and profitable, close quote. Because of Trump, the networks had become anti-Trump, and the national security establishment gained dangerous strength. Arkin claims that he's ever so happy to return to writing and thinking in new books without the officiousness of editorial tyrants or corporate standards. He continues, and of course I yearn to go back to my first love, which is writing boring reports about secret programs, grateful that the American government so graciously obliges in its constant supply. Arkin doesn't put down his colleagues at NBC. He rather wanly praises his former employers, the excellent young television reporters and the great team he worked with, which lead me believes he'd like to go back someday. He's not a bitter man, though I expect he's not likely to be a leftist hero. While acknowledging that Trump is an ignorant and incompetent imposter, Arkin wonders if the television networks aren't in favor of more conflict and more war. Quote, we shouldn't get out of Syria. We shouldn't go for the bold move of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Do we really yearn for the Cold War? And don't get me started about the FBI. What? We now lionize this historically destructive institution? Close quote. That's William Arkin. Fisk says, I get Arkin's point, even if he's still in danger of making the presidential lunatic into a statesman-to-be in generations to come. But there's a telling moment in his goodbye letter to NBC, which is longer than any general's resignation from the White House, by the way. He says that journalists have become exhausted parents of our infant and infantile social media children. And because of the cycle, the 24-hour news system, we at NBC suffer from a really bad case of not being able to ever take a breath. I also don't think that we're on a straight line towards digital nirvana. I sense that there's already smartphone and social media fatigue creeping across the land, and my guess is that nothing we currently see, nothing that is snappy or chatty, will solve our horrific challenges of information overload or the role and nature of journalism. Well, maybe it's true that when Trump goes, we'll all suffer from a gigantic media hangover. I'm not so sure. Where Arkin gets it wrong, it seems to me, is his faith that his own fact-digging will somehow come back into fashion in a world where falling in line with the authorities, the FBI, the comfortable generals, and the taboo on talking about Israel and America will be discarded in the face of hard-hitting journalism. As a matter of fact, that particular taboo and is talking about the Israeli-American relationship, all important when Trump is in love with Benjamin Netanyahu, appears to be strictly observed in Arkin's own goodbye letter. It doesn't get a mention. I'm delighted to hear that this particular expert is now going to write another nonfiction essay on national security and why we never seem to end our now perpetual state of war. But the account of the commitment of the mainstream media to war and war reporting that this long-term reporter offers in his resignation is the heart of the matter. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on January 15th in the third week of 2019, another week in which everyone can see the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. aids the Saudis in their genocidal war in Yemen, and the Israelis in their racist oppression of the Palestinian people. On this show, we concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman. Thanks, and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to whom this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and the attacks on WikiLeaks. This is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying the words of the late broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.